Good morning, everyone. When I was asked to speak, I thought, oh, I don't have anything to say. Okay, those of you who know me, I am rarely at a loss for words. And whoever it was, I can't remember, she said, Pam, I know you have a lot to say. So let me talk a little bit about my time in Nepal. The title of this talk is 20 Years in Nepal, Expanding Community and Growing Toward Justice. So first, let me say to all of you, Hajur Lai Namaste. Hajur is a pronoun that is the highest one. And Namaste, I think many of you know that word, even if it's only from yoga class. Nepal is a small country. It's only about 550 miles long and about 150 miles wide at its widest point, about the size of Arkansas. But they like to say they're the nut in the big nutcracker. If you look at a map, they stretch along the top of India and the bottom of what some people call the country of Tibet, but others, China, says it's a Tibet autonomous region. And so they've always struggled, and it's landlocked. So they rely on everything that comes in either air or through Calcutta, actually. And that has caused problems because they have to placate the big guys so they don't get squashed. Okay, so I didn't live in Nepal for 20 years. Don't even ask why I wrote that. I did, though, live there for almost 10 years combined in the 1980s and the early 20-teens. In addition, my husband and I traveled and trekked there in 1981, 1983, and again in 1999. I can honestly say that my time in Nepal has affected my life profoundly, and I am so grateful for that. In fact, we actually came to Bozeman from Nepal because of mountaineering friends we got to know in Kathmandu. You may have seen kind of a cryptic query I threw out there about this talk, being both a minority and a majority. First of all, it is an amazing thing to be an Asian person who grew up in America to go to Asia and be in the majority. It's like, man, I'm gonna walk big around here. It's an amazing feeling. I mean, you should try it. It's amazing. Anyway, of course in Nepal we were a minority too because we were expats, right, expatriates. So we had a distinct perspective, and also, to be absolutely honest, we're given a lot of kudos just for existing, partly because we're Americans. Americans have had a big role there. In my talk today, I'll be using a few of our Unitarian principles as a lens to take a closer look at my time living in Nepal, comparing the first time we went there with the second time we lived there 27 years later. To be clear, Nepal is a complex country with more than 100 social groups, castes, and ethnic groups. A lot of people think about Mount Everest, but that's really only a very, very small part of what Nepal is. The people there speak about that many languages and dialects of those languages, over 100. According to the US State Department, as far as religion, about 80% are Hindu, 9% are Buddhist, smaller than you think, I bet. Muslims are 4.4% and Christians 1.4% and growing. So when we talk about in the 80s what Nepal was like, I want to talk about the inherent worth and dignity of every person and justice and equity. And that is covered in our first, second, and sixth principles, that word justice actually. And for those of you who might not know this, because I sure didn't, our principles were created around 1960 and then changed in 1985, and we're actually thinking of adopting an eighth principle. So when you think about inherent worth and dignity, what do we do every day that recognizes that here in America, in our daily lives? Well, you see that every time when you greet the first person with whom you will have a relationship in Nepal. Maybe not the taxi driver from the airport, but your landlord, your boss, your colleague, anyone else that you live there. That's when you see that recognition of shared humanity and divinity. When you both smile, you look at each other in the eye and you say, Namaste, because that is what that message is. I recognize the God in you. There is, however, also a subtle recognition of status or your place in society. Where are your hands located when you say Namaste? Are they down here? Namaste. Are they up here? Namaste. Or are they like middle, maybe around here? Well, there's a clear hierarchy that is acknowledged when you do that. So when I was greeted when I came to the office, the sweeper, which is the person who sweeps They don't have long broom handles down here. They clean the bathrooms. The Poons, those are the gophers who do photocopies, run errands, or the tea ladies who bring tea twice a day to wherever you are in the building exactly the way you like it. They would say to me, namaste, like that, hands up here. And of course, I didn't do that back, excuse me. I would just go, namaste, you know, and it's just so awkward. We Americans say there is no class and there is no status, and we are, of course, we have that. It's just not in the same way. Now, of course, my admin staff, who were, I had 3 men older than I was a 26-year-old who knew nothing really about the world when I went there. They would say to me, namaste, madame, and I would say to them, namaste, and use their names. Only my closest colleague used my name directly, like Pam G, which a G is a kind of an affectionate sound you add to that. To the big boss, who was an American, if I saw him in the morning, I'd say, hey, Nils, like this. Like, yeah, whatever. He's also a personal friend, you know, about the age of my husband. So, but when the guard at the office greeted me at the gate, there was no namaste. Instead, he would snap to attention by pounding his feet. He would salute and say, mem sap, like mem sap. That's what he would say to me. By the way, they don't use that term anymore there. They use madam or ma'am, something like that. But they did then. So of course I'd be like, I've never been in the military, and I think it's weird to salute when you aren't. So I'd be like, I didn't know. I was just awkward. So I was the administrative officer of the USAID Health Contract Office. I thought my title was office administrator. Hear the difference between that? Administrative officer and office administrator. I mean, so I didn't even feel like I should be in that whole thing. But I was. My husband, who joined the office 4 years later, and I actually left because I didn't think we should be at the same office, he was called Dr. Saab. Like Saab, that S-A-H-I-B word. So I started to realize that along with acknowledging individual worth, there was an accompanying hierarchy of society that was just as long-standing, in fact, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years. The first time came up fairly early, also socially, when we were invited to dinner at a high-ranking Nepalese colleague's home. My husband had been hired at the very beginning as the Peace Corps doctor. In the American expat pantheon, we were like way down there, Peace Corps. But that wasn't how we were treated by our Nepali colleagues, of course. We had had a brief cultural orientation. We'd learned basic salutations, how to sit, and how to eat with our hands. We had learned never to point the bottoms of our feet at anyone, not to use our left hand for food, and not to touch the head of another person, because the head was the holiest part of the body. The left hand was used to clean oneself after using the toilet, and feet were the lowest and least clean part of the body. Using an unclean part of the body improperly around food or around other people was seen as polluting, and so listen to that word, polluting the food or the other person, and it was the absolute highest insult. Our host and his wife, she was also our language teacher, greeted us at the door of their home, lots of big namaste, so big smiles. Several other colleagues followed us in, and we all took our shoes off in the hall and stepped over a threshold into a big room with a carpet. And we made a circle and sat down. Household servants came in with tea and snacks, and then they started handing out large metal plates of food to each person. We were all sitting kind of cross-legged or legs crossed, behind, you know, so our feet pointed behind us. And after a few words of welcome from our host, we began eating. Right hand only, even if you're left-handed. Our hostess was surprisingly not eating with us, so catching sight of her in the hall, and I remember this distinctly because of what happened after, outside the room, I called out to her by her name, and I said, oh, why don't you come and eat with us? And I thought she'd say, oh, yeah, you know, I've got so much going on in the kitchen. That's what we say, right? She said nothing. She kept on walking, and her husband then said, oh, she's going away, and she's unable to eat with us now. It's her time of month. And I sat there going, you know, trying to control my face. At this time, I was 26 years old. I had a degree in linguistics, a master's degree in speech and hearing, and I had lived in France on an exchange year, but I really didn't know much about the world. When I heard our host, I had this mix of embarrassment, outrage, and sadness. I was shocked that this custom occurred among well-educated professionals who I learned had worked with Americans for many, many years. Peace Corps came to Nepal in the 60s when it began. I only found out later that in some villages, women spent the first few days of their period alone in a small building, and food is brought to them so they do not pollute the rest of the household during that time. After a ritual bath, the women are purified and they return to the family. I thought then about cleanliness and what we think about cleanliness and how we use soap and water to make dirty things clean. We teach our children about germs. I'm sure they're like, germs. And in fact, the Nepalis who are less educated, like the lower status people in our neighborhood, I would talk about hand washing. They'd be like, the only word I could use was insects. You have insects on your hands that are invisible. I mean, the woman who worked for us, I would tell her about that and she'd go, okay, I'll wash my hands like you say. But ritual impurity and status based on gender are a part of the culture. They're not a result of dirt, and they cannot be washed away. We talk about, in our principles, the inherent worth of every human being. Well, as you probably already know, one group of people in Nepal, the Dalit people, are inherently unclean from birth. According to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they make up about between 13 and 20% of Nepal's population. That's at least 3.5 million people. There's just about 30 million in Nepal. They do the dirtiest jobs in society. They are the street cleaners, the ones who dispose of animal carcasses and human waste. Even their shadow falling on food can render the food inedible for people who is of a higher caste. We'll talk more about caste in a second. To be clear, caste practices occur primarily in Hindu groups, but as I said, about 80% of Nepalis are Hindu. For the Buddhists, Christians, and animists, and there are animists of Nepal, do not use caste rules, and many Nepalese practice a mixture of religious traditions. And one thing also I found out is if their shadow fell on a doorway, that's also means that you can't pass across it until it's been purified. So they stay away from homes unless they're asked to come and take waste away or something like that. But I want to talk about Nepal growing towards justice, equity, and compassion, which we actually saw ourselves. Nepal has been changing, and because of losing the monarchy, which I could tell you more about later, and becoming a democracy, a parliamentary democracy, our second time in Nepal, we learned that Nepal's constitution actually bars discrimination by caste. Actually, I've heard that there are some people of Indian descent in California that want a California law because they are discriminated against in tech, people of lower caste from India. Specific laws in Nepal have now been drafted to protect the rights of the Dalit people. Enforcement of those laws is happening, but slowly. While we were there, the newspaper highlighted the destruction of menstrual huts in western Nepal. The police complained that they had destroyed the huts more than once, but the people kept on rebuilding them. They're not well built. But a high Brahmin colleague in the office, and I call it our office because I was the administrator there 27 years earlier, and I knew people, I'd hired people who were there and had gone way up. It was so cool. So he spoke proudly, this Brahmin man, about marching with the Dalit people side by side to protest for their rights in Kathmandu. That would not have happened in the 80s. So that is what had happened. I had the honor of hosting an amazing Dalit human rights leader, Suvash Darnal, and some of his supporters at our home. He wanted me to review a grant application to an American foundation to support his NGO or his nonprofit. Suvash said he was fighting for his daughter so that she could be treated like a human instead of a dog. Those are his exact words. And I just kind of go, yeah. And then he said, you know what I'm talking about. It's the way America treated blacks. And again, you're like, yes. Because what I'm going to say, no, we did. So he said he was on his way to Washington, D.C. to speak with members of Congress. He did make it to Washington and did speak with them, but sadly he died in a taxi cab accident on his way to the airport back to Nepal. Amazing. Here in America, of course, as I say, we've treated a whole class of people in the same way as being inherently unequal. We don't use the term polluting or, unclean, but we did. I lived in Atlanta for many years in the 1990s. When we first took our kids to the public swimming pool there, even then, we were among the very few non-black people using that pool. And we're just looking around going, what is this? This is so weird. We found out later that white Atlantans in our community, including my husband's colleagues at Emory University and the Centers for Disease Control, they swam at the country club, not at the public pool. But of course, we did not join the country club. And we also, as a country, passed laws discrimination, and we did our best and do our best to enforce them, although sometimes one can think that we are going backwards in that. So when we talk about expanding equity and community in human relations, our second principle, while we were in Nepal the second time, I mostly volunteered with the Nepal Judicial Academy, where I edited their national law journal. After my earlier education, we came back from Nepal. I ended up going to Knight's Law School in Georgia. I also worked for Atlanta Legal Aid, and then we moved back to Bozeman in 1997. At the same time, my older daughter chose to come back to Nepal to do her graduate fieldwork on mental health in widows. Side note, yes, I flew to Bangkok to give birth, and then I brought her back to Kathmandu, and she was raised in Nepal till she was 4.5 and spoke Nepali. We spoke a lot of Nepali at home. The issue of human rights arose in Nepal after 10 years of brutal civil war, where as many as 17,800 people were killed on both sides of the conflict, and more than 80,000 people were displaced within the country. That meant they were forced to leave their villages. Both sides were alleging human rights abuses and war crimes. My daughter told me almost 500,000 widows were suffering greatly due to the loss of their husbands. Many of the journal articles I was editing did address human rights violations, but I wanted to know what those women survivors knew about human rights, not how scholars addressed the topic. It had been 14 years at that time since I had attended law school, and qualitative research was a brand new concept to me. But I wanted to answer a baseline question at which no one had addressed. Did Nepal's 500,000 widows understand what human rights were? Now you would think everybody knows. No, unlike the US, Nepal was never colonized, unlike India, which was also colonized. So they didn't have common law and kind of constitutional concepts in their history. That's what the British brought to India. Instead, they had customary law, which was religious, kind of socio-religious, and it went back centuries and centuries. There were no rights. They didn't have a Magna Carta. They didn't have the king sitting down with all those lords under a tree. I don't know if you remember this from elementary school. But so rights weren't even a thing. The laws were based on relationships and, surprise, status. Who you are in the community was about your rights and responsibilities to others. So there's no concept of rights. So, and I thought maybe the lack of understanding of rights, human rights, be a barrier to the women advocating for themselves to get the benefits they were entitled to. So a cliff notes on property law. Property law in Nepal is based on the concept of a family estate. That concept was a part of that socio-religious Hindu law. Benefits like food, housing, and clothing are provided by the family and the extended family, not the state. Any wages earned were returned to the family unit and were not the private property of the earner. Women were therefore not able to inherit because they were only temporary members of their families that they were born into, of their natal family. They were going to be married, and at marriage, those ties were broken when they left the natal family and went to live with their husband's family. But if the husband died, the woman's connection to her support system was severed, and there was no obligation to support her. None. Only kindness, no duty there. Thus, in the 1980s, it was not uncommon for us to see older women dressed in white, which is the color of death. And I'll talk a little bit more about the colors in a minute. Begging in the streets of Kathmandu. Little old ladies, just with a little thing. Sometimes they had a little kid with them. I don't know what that relationship was. And they would just be begging at the doors of the restaurants and things, where all the tourists were. So not only financial support, but social status, which is at least as important, was taken away from widows. The markers of marriage were taken away at the funeral pyre. Nepal no longer had sati, which you may have heard of. It's this thing where the widow is burned along with the corpse of the husband. Right, and that was seen as the ultimate sacrifice for her and a gesture of love. It was pretty awful, but it still, her marriage beads, and I have some on right now. When women get married, they get this, in these Hindu groups, large, big thing of red big, and it's so large that it stretches half their bodies, and there's often a golden clasp, solid gold, 24-karat gold clasp. So, and then after that, you try to match your beads to your clothes, like I did every day when I went to work. But they would take them off and literally break them. And she also wore glass bangles that tinkle. They're really pretty. Break those too with a rock right there. And all the time, her hair is down. She is sobbing. And then they're tearing the sari, which is the garment that's 6 meters long that you wear and wrap around your body, which are usually red and pink or have colors of red and pink, because that's what you get to wear as a privilege when you get married. Red and pink and scarlet colors are the colors of joy and happiness. And that is torn, and she's draped in white only. They also throw away the sindur. This is a red powder that you put every day when you're married in the morning. You put on your makeup and you put your sindur, because that shows you're married and how happy you are. And that is also discarded right there next to the pyre, and I actually saw this at the sides of the river where the bodies are being burned. Then she was shunned from the house if there was not enough and told to just beg for her food. Some of the women were also somehow determined to be witches, probably after they'd begged for a while and they weren't very clean, and they were publicly abused by family and community members. And I'm talking about physical measures, and I don't even want to go into some of the absolute worst. Harshest of all, if there were children, they stayed with the husband's family, and their mother was cast out. But as Nepal began to modernize, Nepalese society began addressing these long existing social injustices. In 2002, the constitution was amended, granting the right of inheritance to women. Amazing and wonderful. A government program was initiated that provided either a lump sum or a small monthly death benefit to widows, depending on if the spouse was in the military or police versus if they were a combatant in this civil war. But despite the efforts of our partner NGO in enrolling more than 100,000 widows to receive their benefits, very few of them had claimed what was due to them. I theorized that those women could not advocate for themselves due to their social constraints, but only they could answer that question in their own words through qualitative research. So in our research, we did find that both self-imposed and societal barriers were stopping women from getting their benefits and property. Most of the women thought that basic rights were human rights. When you ask them, what is human rights to you? They would say, it's the right to have food, the right to not be physically and verbally abused in public, and the right to attend community events, such as festivals. Some of the most, and Nepal has more holidays than we do. I want to say at least 3 times more. There's always a celebration. Rarely did they mention that the state had a part in supporting them. It was also difficult to change the widow's traditional view that the husband's family unit was their sole support, because that's the traditional view that went back and back and back. We did, however, find that the programs of our partner NGO were slowly helping women advocate for themselves. They had village-level education programs for mothers-in-law alongside their daughters-in-law. And that's, of course, the traditional enmity, right? The daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law. Programs that educated other men in the family along with the single woman. In Nepali, the word for widow is single woman, ekal maila. And so that's why I use that term. And also, programs that trained single women in literacy and small business skills so they could support themselves after losing access to their husband's financial resources or any resources. In the words of one of the women from the program, we have the right to receive what is due to us, but I realize that the right has to be taken, not received by simply requesting it. So now we have come so far that they have stopped repeating to us, the hen should not crow. And we are now able to get our ancestral property. We are still fighting for the property of our forebears. When the Constitution is finally written, we will ensure our rights are written, and we will not give up. In both Nepal and the United States, we are still working on expanding community and growing toward justice. The Nepalese parliament is 33% women, by law actually, and our Congress, woo-hoo, is 27% women. Aren't we awesome? One final story. The Judicial Academy, where I worked, is staffed primarily by lawyers and jurists, judges in all levels. There were a couple of women maybe, but pretty much everyone there is male. And the official title for my male colleague, my boss actually, not the colleagues, was Sriman. Sriman, translated in English, is the word husband. So every time I would go to my boss's office to ask him something, I'd say, husband, could you look at this? It was like, female attorneys in Nepal, many of whom are not married, have tried to change this custom to using the term your honor, but they haven't succeeded yet. It was really awkward for me. I would do it, of course. I would not do it, but I did think, okay, some of these things have to change. There was a couple of female justices on the Supreme Court. I am almost positive they were not addressed as husband. I just don't know what they were called because I never got to talk with them, not in Nepali anyway. So I want to thank you for living out our UU principles alongside all of us together here. I think we forget how hard it is to think about how those things developed and how it is different in other places. And I also want to thank you for inviting me to talk about my time in Nepal, and I will be available for a few minutes for questions at coffee time. Namaste, tapaiharulai, namaste. All right.